I'm happy to offer the land acknowledgement today. I respectfully acknowledge our OCS offices are located on the traditional lands and gathering places for Treaty 6 and 7, Region 3 and 4 of the Métis Nations of Alberta. These lands are the home of the diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibway, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Metis and Inuit peoples, and many other whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant communities today. In keeping with the tradition of gathering, these science seminars provide an opportunity for us to get together to exchange knowledge on exciting science happening across Alberta in an open learning and sharing environment. The hope is that through our dialogue today, we are all able to improve our awareness and understanding and put this knowledge into practice to support evidence-informed decision-making wherever that occurs. Now, to help maintain our call quality, your video and audio have been disabled. Again, we encourage you to enter any questions and comments you have at any time during or after the presentation via the Teams chat function. I will read out the questions and comments in the order that they were received. Today, we welcome Dr. Vic Adamowicz. Vic is the Vice Dean in the Faculty of Agriculture, Life and Environmental Sciences, and a distinguished university professor in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology at the University of Alberta. His research has focused on the economic valuation and environmental amenities and ecosystem services and the incorporation of environmental values into economic analysis, with applications for outdoor recreation, health, water quality, air quality, endangered species, forests, and agriculture. His research also involves the analysis of economic choice behavior with applications to food demand, recreation, and environmental quality. Over to you, Vic.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here. I hope that audio is still okay. Got the thumbs up. That's good. Well, it's, as I say, a real pleasure to be here today. I'm actually at the University of Minnesota today in St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'll do my own land acknowledgement from here. The university is on the traditional territories of the Dakota people. And the Dakota words Minnesota Makoche, which the state name comes from, translates to land where waters reflect the skies. So it's interesting being here too, chatting about chronic wasting disease with some of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota. So let me share my screen and get things started. There we go. There's the title slide. Let me just describe a little bit of what I'm going to try to accomplish this afternoon. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the recently published work we've had on social and economic impacts. Some of the methods that we're using as well. I think it's not that common perhaps to have social scientists working in these types of areas, so and economists in particular. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes just describing some of the methods and some of the things that we do. Talk a little bit about some preliminary findings of some ongoing projects, and the word preliminary is going to show up a few times here. And I really want to talk about three subject or topic areas, and we can engage in these in the question and answer period later as well, if you wish. I'm going to start with a big one, and that's on chronic wasting disease management. What does the public support? And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by the public shortly. So what kind of management programs would the public support? The second one is something that is of interest to lots of folks around North America, and that is chronic wasting disease affecting the demand for hunting. And I put demand in quotes there because I'm going to come back and talk about what I mean by that. And then the last one is more focused on management options. And the question that we've been looking at for the last several years is, will hunters respond to chronic wasting disease management options or strategies? And what types of programs might be most interest to them? And then because we're economists, we're often interested in the benefits or costs of these management scenarios. So are there economic benefits associated with some of the scenarios that we might try to engage for CWD management? I'm going to spend a couple of minutes at the end just talking about some new things that are getting going, some exciting things that Some are in collaboration with the Ministry of Alberta Environment Protected Areas. I'm trying to get the name right. I think that's the new one. And then I'll do a wrap-up or a summary at the end. I'm going to start by just making sure that everybody is kind of on the same page in terms of what chronic wasting disease is. I'm a bit out of my lane because I'm an economist or social scientist, but I think it's always good to set this base. So chronic wasting disease is a prion disease, misfolded proteins that result in fatalities, in this case with deer or cervid species, of course, relations to mad cow disease and other types of disease, but CWD is a prion disease. So what are the mechanisms for transmission? They're animal-to-animal mechanisms. I'm actually going to just pull up my cursor here for a second, my pointer. I like this graphic on this side because it kind of captures these dimensions. So the mechanisms of animal to animal, you can see here, we've got a variety of different mechanisms for prion transmission, but also interestingly, contaminated environments. So prions can stay in the soil, some concern about them being on plants. So there are environmental elements of prion diseases. Or there are concerns about species susceptibility. So cervids, of course, are susceptible almost by definition, given that it's a prion disease. And I think within the group of cervids, deer, elk, moose, obviously, but also caribou and boreal caribou are species at risk. And so we're concerned about susceptibility or transmissibility to caribou. There are other non-human species that are susceptible. Again, if we look at that graphic on the right-hand side, there are a variety of different species that have potential susceptibility or perhaps unknown yet. So again, we can talk about some of those, and there's a fair amount of literature on which ones may be more or less susceptible. Of course, as being a social scientist, and I think much of the concern is around transmissibility to humans. And there are epidemiological studies, so studies that have tried to look back at individuals who have been eating venison or other types of game meats and looking for patterns. There hasn't been any evidence that I know of within those studies. There are studies on primates, laboratory studies. I've listed this one by Herman Schestel. That's actually described by a summary. Otero Garcia, Debbie McKenzie, and Judd Aiken wrote a nice summary in a paper that we wrote that I'll show you in a minute, a kind of document overview on CWD. There they describe some of the updates and really some increasing concerns about transmissibility or potential transmissibility to humans. And then this paper, Hananui et al., and that was described by Sabine Gilch in a previous seminar in this series, very interesting new studies describing some, again, increasing concerns around transmission of CWD. But the bottom line is, and this is the one that I keep checking and seeing within the agencies, no known evidence of no known transmission to humans. But of course, agencies advise against eating meat that hasn't been tested or has tested positive. Let's talk about the impact. So in terms of people, so a wide range of potential societal impacts. And I'm going to spend most of my time talking about wild cervid populations. And there, I think we can put the concerns into two categories. One is concerns about wildlife health, having healthy wildlife populations for harvesting, for viewing, for tourism is important to people, but also this potential human health risk or human health concern. That's another one of the categories. And I've just listed several of the stakeholders or potential impacts, Indigenous people and communities, both in terms of harvesting as well as concerns around human health. Métis Nation, Treaty 6, 7, 8, they all have CWD communications, interests in CWD, and concerns about CWD. Recreational hunters, the group I'm going to spend most of my time talking about, of course, involved in CWD, monitoring, potentially involved in management. Outfitters and livelihoods guides, another group that potentially affected by CWD and CWD management. And then broader categories, wildlife viewing, tourism, threatened species, what we economists would call passive use values, that people have values for threatened species, but they may not necessarily engage in some kind of economic behavior around them. And then agency concerns around revenue generation associated with licenses. There are farm cervid populations and concerns from the farm cervid sector, consumers as well as the agricultural sector, and the interaction between farm cervids and wild cervids. And then there are broader concerns from livestock owners, landowners in general, concerns about other wild species, and then just broader One Health concerns. And just the last one there are some international trade concerns or implications around the environmental contamination portions of CWD. So those are the whole sort of range, I'm sure there are others, of concerns on the social impacts. And just again, to kind of raise some data, so we've seen the trends. These are trends from the AEPA websites on prevalence. We can see mule deer rising over several years, white-tailed deer prevalence rising. You see that little gap in the bars. That's because the mandatory areas changed, so the surveillance changed. We can look at things spatially, and we can see where in 2019, at least, this is a map that I'm displaying what the prevalence of CWD is across different wildlife management units. And it's probably tough to read some of those numbers, but those darker areas are in between 30 and 55%. And of course, CWD isn't just in Alberta, it's in other provinces and many US states. And I just pull up the Saskatchewan map, you can see the corresponding CWD areas and some very high prevalence rates in some of those wildlife management zones within Saskatchewan. So let's start with this first question. So what CWD management programs might the public support? And just to look back in the literature a bit, I've put up this Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute report that's available on the web. It's got a lot of background information on CWD and a number of the studies that have been done historically. And I bring up this chart. This is actually from work mostly led by my colleague Ellen Goddard at the University of Alberta. You can see a whole range of different management programs. Take no action at the top, down to freezer locations, public meetings, etc. The left-hand side of this graph is the public sentiment. The right-hand side are hunters, different time periods, different categories. What are the takeaways from this? Well, one takeaway is that taking no action, it has negative signs on this particular graph. So that is not a desirable action, either for hunters or for the public. And the other takeaway is just look at the similarity between hunters and the public. And they're almost identical in their patterns. And again, I think that's an interesting feature that we've seen historically in the data. We also see that there's broad support for a wide variety of options. They change a bit over time, but broad support by the general public, the positive side of these graphs. So what have we done lately about this? These are back to 2018. Let me just describe one of the newer studies that just came out a few months ago. So this is work led by Jeff DeRoche, and you can see the other colleagues there, Marty Lukert, Ellen Goddard, and I. This is done, the methods are surveys. So these are surveys of Canadians. This is a national sample, so that's what we're looking at in terms of the public. We can break it down by province, but I'll just show you some national numbers. Fairly large sample. It's reasonably representative in terms of the Canadian population, at least based on what we can observe. This is a bit of a different method. Rather than just having people rate different management options, we actually ask them to choose. If you had a couple of different options and they had the same outcome, which one would you prefer? So it has people to actually put things into a ranking. And so we get an implicit ranking of different types of management programs. So what did we see in the data? Again, I'm just going to highlight a few of these. I put a red circle around that one. General public, there is not support for sharpshooters on public land. And one of the management programs that has been proposed in some jurisdictions. So that was pretty widespread support to not do that. But hunter harvests increasing on public land, widespread support, restricted movement of carcasses, widespread, not hunters, but widespread among all other groups within the populations that were surveyed. Among hunters, additional hunting tags is widespread support. Hunting tags plus payments, widespread support. We'll come back to that one. And then from landowners, environmental sampling on private land. So again, interesting kind of public involvement role that some of this information is playing, I hope, to show what kinds of things individuals in the public and some of these other categories are interested in. I think one of the takeaways is that we're seeing from the public widespread support for hunter harvest and management. and from hunters generally, not entirely, but generally. So that's the first question. Second question, is CWD affecting the demand for hunting? So what do I mean by demand for hunting? We can think about this in a number of ways. One is by applications for draw licenses, and that's actually what I'll show some information on shortly. It could also be the number of trips taken. Are hunters continuing to hunt in those regions? Are some hunters no longer hunting? Those provide us with some measures of economic impact. If individuals are taking fewer trips, they're spending less money in those regions, they're getting less satisfaction from those activities. It also could provide us with some information on license revenues, if we're seeing trends or some changes arising because of CWD. On the flip side, if there is less concern about CWD and harvesting, hunters are more likely to play a role in management if they're interested in harvesting CWD positive deer and going through the management process. And the literature has bounced around, and I will admit that my own views in this literature have bounced around. In the early years of CWD, the literature was showing either through actual observations of licenses or through stated intentions, declines in licenses purchased with CWD increases. So Bishop and Haberline, those papers are from Wisconsin. Zimmer et al. Was some work we did in Alberta. Now, those were some of the early years with CWD. There's some more recent literature that suggested either a rebound, so those hunters came back or the numbers came back up in aggregate, or a limited impact of CWD on licenses or applications. Holland et al. In the US and Patterson Williams et al., that was our group in Alberta. That was using data to about 5 years ago. And then the question came up in the review process, is this going to change as CWD prevalence gets higher, as other information arises? So what are the methods we're using? We're using surveys, so we're asking people questions about what are their thoughts on CWD and their activities. But we're also doing data analysis. We're doing analysis, in this case, of license applications. Mule deer draw license applications are one that we're particularly interested in. So some of the survey data, this is just a slide from one of the reports that was put together that has a wide array of survey data collected over a number of years that we've been working on this. A couple of things to take away from here. The left-hand side is CWD has changed where I hunt. By and large, folks disagree. So over this time period from 2007, our very first surveys, to 2020, most folks are in the category of disagreeing in terms of changing their hunting location. But the other thing to notice is that people are different. Some folks strongly agree that it's affected their choice of where to hunt. So that's another issue with all of our analysis, is that we can't just say the public or all individuals will respond a certain way. People have different preferences and different risk perceptions. And on the right-hand side, the same kind of data for I eat or give away the meat before getting CWD test results. And you can see a wide variety of opinions, pretty stable over time, but a wide variety of opinions or views on how CWD has affected their behavior. This is, I think, a nice study in collaboration between what we've been doing at the university and your agency and the Alberta government. I mean, these surveys were all facilitated through Alberta Environment Protected Areas. The report is linked on the Chronic Wasting Disease Reports webpage. So it's really been fantastic working with our colleagues at the Alberta government. I'm going to now present something that's preliminary, so unpublished. I was going to put that in big flashing lights. So this is our most recent analysis, updating some of the work that we've done before. We're looking at more years, up to 2022 applications. We're looking at the data sources that include the license application database and other information from AEPA. What we're trying to explain is license applications by Wildlife Management Unit with a number of explanatory variables, including CWD. And I can talk a little bit more about the methods if you wish, but we're using some methods that try to reduce omitted variable bias and try to really focus on the variable of interest, which in our case is chronic wasting disease prevalence or incidence. So there's a lot of numbers here. Let me focus on a few things. Let me show you three different forms of this model. The first one is CWD incidence rate. Remember, this is the impact on applications, and we're seeing a negative and significant sign. So this is one of the first times we've seen this in these data, that there is a negative impact on applications rates. I will quickly say this is statistically significant, but actually relatively small in terms of its impact on applications. We then tried a couple of different specifications. We try one where we examine if it's below 5%. If CWD levels are below 5%, there doesn't appear to be significant impact on applications. But if they're above 5%, it does appear to be negative and significant. And we play that same kind of game for the 10% rate. Again, below 10%, no apparent impact. Above 10%, we're seeing a negative impact. So again, caution, preliminary, not published yet, but these are the things that we're digging into, and we still have work to do. We have a number of different models and other types of data that we're going to include in this analysis. But at least for now, I think it's worth us thinking about this. There's some evidence that we're starting to see applications decline. But while statistically significant, it's still relatively small. So if we had a move from 10 to 20% of CWD prevalence, that would result in about a 7% decline in applications taken directly from those regression models. So there might be a threshold at 10%. So some of those higher CWD zones may be seeing more of this type of effect, but this is still relatively small in terms of the total number of applications. There's this point that most WMUs have excess demand, so there are more applications than there is quota available. So the relative size of this decline is quite small, but worth noting. That's what we've seen in antlered, and we're finding similar patterns in antlerless mule deer licenses. So there's just one example of examination of actual data with statistical models, but also updating and replication of some of our previous work just to keep tabs on this. Question 3. Will hunters respond to CWD management programs? We are looking at hunter preferences over a bunch of different programs. We've looked at them over time and have spent some time talking about extended hunting seasons with some extra tags in some cases as one of the options to try to target harvest to reduce populations. Other locations around North America have provided monetary rewards. They provided other kinds of rewards. We'll look at those. We're going to try to examine what people actually do, and then we're going to put them in scenarios, what we call contingent behavior, and ask them what they would do if they were in a particular context. That's going to give us some information on trip behavior, on harvesting behavior, and it also tells us something about the economic impacts of these kinds of chronic wasting disease management options. So again, methods, we're going to use surveys. So we've been surveying hunters over the past several years. We're going to use those survey data to construct models, econometric models of hunter behavior, really, where people are going to go, how often they're going to go, what types of behaviors they're going to engage in. We just look at the surveys first, and you can see a variety of different views. Hunter preferences for reducing local herds, a mixture, pretty reasonable agreement, but there are fairly large numbers that don't agree with reducing local herds. Providing extra tags in high-risk areas, I'd say there's a lot more agreement. Again, not unanimous, but more agreement. And if we look at the right-hand side, the management actions that have been taken by the agencies, mandatory submission of heads, freezer location, really strong preference for those types of management programs. And of course, one can do things in combination. Let's turn to the economic analysis. So this is first a paper that's just coming out. You can see the word proof is still on the side of the draft that's there. We're just finishing the galley proofs. That's really looking or focusing on extended seasons. So a sample of licensed hunters, mule deer special licenses, examining what they did, where did they go in the previous season, and then giving them a scenario of if there was an extended season, how would you change your behavior? And we're examining where people went and how often they went within these models. So under the regular or revealed preference or actual trips, we're getting an average number of trips per person of about 10. If we provide these scenarios to them, we see that they're going to hunt more often, take more trips. The graph or the images on the right-hand side show you where the trips would be located. Again, these scenarios are described with additional opportunities in specific wildlife management units. We're examining how often they go as a function of travel costs, how far away they live from those places, attributes like CWD, and the demographic information about individuals. What do we learn? Well, we learned that these extended seasons actually provide economic benefits, that if they were implemented for chronic wasting disease management, they would generate benefits of, on total, about $200 per hunter who was involved in it. And depending on which of the wildlife management series, 100 series or 200 series and so on, would generate different amounts of economic benefits. So that's good from a couple of standpoints. One is that there would be engagement in such programs. The other one is that there would also be an economic benefit associated with this activity. It'd be costly to run the program, but the economic benefits from the additional hunting activity would arise from these kinds of actions. So what are we seeing? Individuals would be changing their spatial and temporal behavior if they had this opportunity. That's what the models are telling us. Going to generate additional trips, actually are interested in hunting in CWD areas. Those are popular areas. They would be game to go in those locations. They're not adversely affected by the CWD prevalence in these cases, and it generates these economic gains. And we can characterize the monetary value of those economic gains depending on the location. So that's one study of examining hunter behavior and trip behavior. We looked at some other incentive programs. This is again with Lucy Shee and this is again recently been accepted for publication in a journal called Land Economics. Here we expand the set of incentives. So we look at season expansion. We also look at providing extra tags separately. We also mimic some of the programs that were trialed in Wisconsin of providing gift cards or monetary rewards. We've got 3 years of data from surveys in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And again, we're using these models of hunting trip choice. We're not only interested in the preferences for the different management programs, we're also interested in seeing just how stable our models are over time. Are we getting the same kind of response over these 3 years of data? And I'm just going to show you one clip of some of the results from this. 4 different types of scenarios, 2 different season expansions, extra tags for hunting in November, or gift cards. You get some idea of the size of things that we offered people. Those are the 4 different scenarios, again, based in part on things that were offered in Wisconsin and in other US states. And what do we find? This is a fancy word, this psi parameter estimates just really means which ones bring them the most satisfaction or the most interest. And the extra tags are the one that wins out, if you will, in terms of preference by hunters, and pretty stable over time. All of these programs are positive in that they're all generating benefits or utility and economic benefits through these kinds of incentives. The one that probably is of least interest are the October extended seasons. So people seem to prefer December over October, and gift cards are somewhere down in that mix as well. And last one, I'm going to change the discussion of these incentives a little bit and air a little bit of our dirty laundry in economics. And the challenge for what we're doing is that we can have actual trip behavior. We can ask people where they went, but it's very difficult for us to run experiments if we change CWD management options actually in the field. I mean, it's possible, and it'd be really interesting to do that, but difficult to do that and actually identify the impact of those. So we use these kinds of scenarios. There are concerns about using scenarios. There are concerns about responses to surveys, what we call selection bias, that we may not get a good representative sample of hunters. There are also concerns about whether people will respond accurately in terms of these hypothetical scenarios. Lots of work to try to improve our questioning, and that's a big part of our literature, is to try to describe things so that folks will give accurate responses, but that's always a concern. So what's an alternative? And this is one of the newer things that we've tried. It sounds a little wild, but it's been really interesting to set it up. And that's to create a controlled experiment. So we literally created a hunting game economic experiment. Economic experiments are very common. They're often run in computer labs or in online environments. They're used for testing all kinds of different policy options and examining what the outcomes would be. We modified that approach to examine chronic wasting disease and hunting. Now, often these experiments use students because they're done by people at university. We thought it'd be really interesting to compare students and hunters and see if we got the same response. The advantage is it's a controlled experiment. It's just like any other experimental approach. We can randomize treatments across people, so we get that kind of experimental control, but it's obviously an unusual context. So this is a paper, again, Lucy Shi and others under review. Yeah, I'm just going to show you a couple of the graphics associated with this. If you look at this top graphic, this is just like any experiment. We have a group that we're putting into treatments. They start with a control round. We provide them with some treatments, and then we put them back into a control round. We have control groups that do the same control rounds through all of the periods. What are our treatments? Well, our treatments are extra hunting tags, or extra hunting tags and what we're calling pro-social information. So providing people with some additional information about the conservation benefits of chronic wasting disease management through additional harvesting. We also tried fixed monetary rewards, something like that Wisconsin program of providing direct monetary rewards. We also tried a lottery. What if every harvested deer gives you a draw in a lottery? And the nice thing is we can control these different treatments much like an experiment, but of course it's not people out in the field actually hunting. They're playing a hunting game on a computer. What do we see in the data? Well, we just look at this control group. These are folks that are just engaged in the hunting game. Their data bounce around. This is now reporting the number of trips that they take. If we provide them with treatments of extra tags or extra tags and information, you can see the number of trips goes up. So they're responding to these. They're actually getting more benefit out of the activity. And this is the kind of response that we would expect. If we provide them with different kinds of fixed rewards or lottery rewards, again, we see an increase in the number of trips over those treatment rounds, and we can interpret the data relative to what we'd expect. So just like any kind of experiment, we're looking for those signals. What do we find? Well, this would take a long time to explain in all detail, but basically, extra tags gave us the expected result: positive response, activity engaged in additional hunting to support CWD management. The pro-social information, providing the conservation scripts and additional information, really didn't get much extra effect. So there was no additional component associated with that. The two monetary rewards, we got an expected effect in terms of increased activity, but it was less than what we actually expected in theory. And so we call that in our literature crowding out, that individuals are actually not responding the way we'd expected. They're putting less into the conservation activity than we would have expected through the theoretical model. So those we're kind of casting some doubt on in terms of use as a policy instrument. So let me wrap up this one with some of those conclusions. The pro-social information, actually, interestingly, the students responded to it, the hunters didn't. So the information scripts didn't appear to matter to hunters. Monetary incentives, again, different responses, but the hunters were not as interested in the monetary rewards for hunting. Tags was the best option as far as they were concerned. So a different way of looking at these kinds of treatments, abstract, but highly controlled within an economic experiment. And I'd be happy to answer questions about this after. What's next? Just about through my time. Really three things, and I'll describe these in a little bit more detail. One is making an effort to put our models into a broader interdisciplinary management context. So this is work that's led by Eddie Merrill at the University of Alberta. It's taking biological models, I'll show you a slide again in a second that explains this a bit more, and trying to build in the economic behavioral models that we've been developing. Now, mostly I talked about hunters, but of course landowners play a big role in chronic wasting disease management through their own harvesting, through allowing access, and through responding to different programs. That's another new piece that we're trying to incorporate into this biological and economic model that we're building, as well as just on its own. And lastly, examining the demand and feasibility of CWD vaccines as part of a project that's led by Dr. Sabine Gilch at the University of Calgary. So let me spend a couple more minutes on this. This is quite exciting, true interdisciplinary work. I'm learning a ton by doing this. That's one of the fun parts of interdisciplinary work. So Dr. Merrill and others, Dr. Merrill's leading this with integrated population models. So you can see on the left-hand side of this graphic, that's an IPM for mule deer, and mule deer harvesting will be one of the pieces that goes into this. We're trying to link our economic models of hunter behavior, of license demand, of harvest, of some of the economic impacts, and the landowner behavior into this integrated population model. So bringing those two disciplines together. This is funded by your agency. Alberta Innovates has recently funded the landowner behavior part. So we're really thankful for the resources and the support for this kind of work. So let me wrap up. Chronic wasting disease is really complex. It's complex biologically, but it's also complex socially and economically. We're trying to understand the impact of CWD and CWD management on people and the communities. What I've shown today is some work that we've been doing, but I think there's still lots of open questions. I think what we're seeing in the data is there's widespread support for involvement of hunters in management, and the management programs look quite positive if our data are telling us the story that we think will occur when those go into place. And maybe there's some concerns that we're starting to see again in those very preliminary results about CWD affecting hunting preferences. And I really think this is a great opportunity for interdisciplinary research to actually generate results that I hope are useful in management and for management agencies. That's really what motivates us in doing our work. A whole bunch of thank yous. I'm going to probably forget somebody on this list, so it's busy with my colleagues at the University of Alberta, former graduate students, funding from got environment parks, but environment protected areas, the Prion Research Institute, genome agencies, Alberta Innovates here. We've just had tremendous collaboration with the groups at the Alberta government, and you've got a list of people there. And actually reflecting, I think it was about 2006 or 2007 that Margot Pybus phoned me up and said, can we come over and talk about chronic wasting disease and what kind of economic effects there might be? And that's where those early 2007 surveys started. But a range of colleagues who were helping on that front. And then this latest set of teams, the Alberta Wildlife Population Model team led by Ivy Merrill, and you can see again individuals from the ministry who have been working with us and collaborating. And it's really been a super beneficial approach to trying to do this work. Couldn't be done without it. And let me put my last thank you up. Just a thanks to literally thousands of people that we have talked through surveys, through focus groups, through presentations at conferences, through experiments that we've done. As individuals who have interacted with us and provided a ton of data as well as comments and insights. And I think that's something that we really should be thankful for, is the engagement of individuals in the province and in the country on these topics.
Everyone for joining our science seminar today. Our next and last seminar for 2022 will be on December 13th, and we'll be hosting Dr. Philip McLaughlin from the University of Saskatchewan, who will be presenting on recent insights into the ecology of feral horses in the Alberta foothills. I hope everyone can join us for that. As a reminder, if you're not on our mailing list, to receive invites to our science seminars and would like to be added to it, or if you and your team has work that you would like to share at an upcoming science seminar, please contact the Office of the Chief Scientist at aep.ocs@gov.ab.ca. We'll end that here for today. Thanks again, Vic, for sharing this very interesting, exciting work with us, and to everyone who tuned in, and we'll see you all.